Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to all of our viewers today. Thank you for joining us on our webinar all around implementing resilient IT infrastructure in an uncertain time. This has been sponsored by CloudGen, and we hope you do visit us at some point soon. Today's webinar will be run by Chris Evans of Architecting IT. We are also joined by Francesco Giannoccaro and Tammam Jamal of Public Health England, as well as Tomas Schimper from Knowledgepark in Germany. Our discussion today will be around 4 subject areas broadly on the broad subject of implementing resilient IT infrastructure. We'll be talking about people and process. We'll be talking about adapting infrastructure. We'll be talking around the issues of security and compliance. And we'll be talking about the operational impacts that recent events and recent times have had. But before we introduce you, before we do that, I'd like to introduce you to each of our chairs and panelists. Firstly, Chris Evans, co-founder of Langton Blue, an independent ICT consultancy focused on solving business-related issues. Chris also works as an independent analyst and author and journalist for several different media organizations. Secondly, and please forgive my pronunciation, but Francesco Giannoccaro, who is responsible for the design and development of high-performance computing infrastructure at Public Health England, and he and his team support the scientific and computing function applied to the life sciences and public health interests of England. Tammam currently holds the position of Senior Specialist and Engineer for Public Health England and has served over 10 years experience in virtualization, both hardware and software, as well as infrastructure design and implementation. And lastly, by no means least, we have Tomas Schimper, who heads up the strategy and business development function of Knowledgepark Germany. Knowledgepark is a privately held company that specializes in software solutions for the medical information and telemedicine systems, as well as project management for large-scale healthcare software projects. With that, I can hand you over to Chris now. So Chris, thank you.
Naresh, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for joining today. So I'd like to start, if I may, with this slide that talks about people and process. Now, what do we mean by people and process? Well, as we can imagine, having moved to being in a remote working environment and having that ability, not having that ability to communicate with our colleagues face to face, there's clearly been some changes. So I'd like to just start with the people and process issues and what we've seen. I put up here 3 ideas to get us started, or at least 3 areas that I think are probably going to be interesting. One is moving to a remote workforce. The next is that whole business momentum and how things have changed. And then thirdly, it's just whether we've seen any challenges around technology shortages and of course, training that goes with that. So maybe Tomas, because we came to you last in terms of the presenting there, in terms of introductions. Why don't we start with you and just give us your feedback about what you've seen in this sort of challenge that we've had, and in terms of how it's affected people and process.
Well, yes, you know, we are mainly a development company, so you can expect that the people can easily adapt to the new work thing, and they from time to time already have done home offices, but now working on a daily basis from home office, there comes up new challenges which we have not seen before, right? So in the past, you just move to the next room, ask your colleague, I have a question, can you please help me? And you get an answer within 5 minutes. Now today, you have to schedule a call. Even if you try to call the people directly, they're typically in a call, and things like that happen. So I always say, you know, we are running on break, more or less. Yeah. So things which had happened before in quite some minutes now take half an hour unless you get an answer. So having said this, it's for the people who are technically skilled and have no problems with the infrastructure. So if you're in an organization, which we also have in our wider scope, you know, the doctors, the physicians, which have to now also work partially on teleconference consultation with their patients. They even struggle with the technique and the infrastructure itself, which gives the whole thing an additional challenge and further problems to be solved by IT and the people itself, and they get annoyed. So the people have to change, they have to adapt to the new system, they have to adapt to new work environments and things like that. Beside the social effects, right, if you have developers who work from home all the day more or less alone, have less social contacts, it's also some kind of additional thing which may harm them. Yeah.
Okay, so what about, you just, sorry to interrupt there, but you talked about the idea of two different groups there. You talked about the technologists and you talked about the end users. Have you seen different scenarios for those different groups that you've had to maybe ship out technology to people, maybe people have had to learn how to use technology differently, maybe there's been issues, with personal devices. Has that been a problem in both of those areas, do you think?
Well, no, in the technical guys already had cameras, for example, but all the clinics, there were no camera because it was not used before, right? So first of all, you have to equip all the clinics with cameras, and now you got a shortage on cameras, and buying these cameras which have been easily bought for, I don't know, 20 euros before, now have been 200 euros. Yeah? Suddenly, yeah, and this was, not only the technical setup of the thing, the education of the people, but also now the costs have been rising a lot in the beginning of the crisis, yeah, because everybody now wants to have a camera to do home office and to do video conferencing and things like that. Yeah,
of course. Yeah, Tammam, turning to you, that idea of the technology side of things. Now, you're in a company that has a slightly different scenario, because clearly, rather than being a company that has to work out how to continue in this industry, in this current crisis, you're actually really being driven to the front of this this crisis. So, how have you seen a change in the way that the people and process side of things has worked?
We are. So, Public Health England is at the sort of forefront of the government response to the COVID-19 response because of its status as a Category 1 responder. And the changes, to say that the changes were significant is a bit of an understatement. I think we've had huge demand for, obviously, people. We had existing infrastructure to help colleagues work from home, but the number tripled basically overnight, and it caused a strain. And obviously, we formed cells within ICT to help us respond to this better. We've more than tripled actually the capacity for our remote access. We've also had an increase in number of people actually joining the organisation on a temporary basis to help with various parts of the response. And that meant a logistical nightmare for colleagues in terms of the availability of laptops, procuring laptops and building them, imaging, not within the infrastructure team, but within ICT in general. So it's been a significant change. Okay,
and Francesco, I see a small picture of the Mona Lisa sitting there behind you. I'm guessing you're not in the UK at the moment. You're in Italy. Are you working remotely in Italy all the time? And if so, does that present some problems, or is this, what have you got? What can you add to the discussion that we've had so far?
Sure. So currently, yes, I'm abroad in Italy, visiting my family. I haven't seen them since last Christmas, and finally I was able to come and visiting them last weekend. So I think that we are an organization that promote flexible work, and we have a good portion of colleagues that work remotely. Personally, I work most of the time from our office, and one day maybe per week remotely. But the topic that we are discussing today, how those way of working is changing through the adaptation that we are living for this crisis. Definitely, we have made use of new tools that we were not using on an everyday basis. For instance, we were using tools like electronic board or online board to share project board, and normally only during project where the supplier were not able to meet us. Not for all the project we have been using those additional tools, whereas now we're using for sort of more business as usual and everyday activity. We also have found useful to sort of force our colleague to use a camera, and that creates a more engagement mood during the meeting, as well as the scheduling of during the day of recreational break, where we meet specifically to solve everything but not work, even just for a break of 10 minutes. And these are procedure and sort of process that we are, as I say, introducing because of this new way to work.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because as people who are used to working in an office, we're used to maybe chatting with people in the corridor, maybe having conversations. And Thomas, and your comments were very relevant, because as we look at the way that we talk about how we just go about our jobs, we indirectly have lots of good conversations about things that develop into maybe things we spot that are probably going wrong in an organization, or maybe going well. And all of that is very difficult to recreate when we're all remote.
The information between the lines is lost, more or less.
Yeah. Okay. So,
or you have to gain it in a different way. You have to call the people personally and have to talk a little bit generally, and then you get the information you typically get on the corridor, right?
Yeah, and that's got to be one of the most probably one of the most difficult things from a personal perspective. But let's go on, and I'll just bring up the next slide here, and we'll talk next about the whole idea of adapting infrastructure. Now, when we talk about this, we're talking about what changes might people have made over the last 3 or 4 months in terms of looking at their technology, perhaps moving to public cloud, perhaps there's been issues with demand, in terms of being able to get hold of equipment, being able to get vendors on site, being able to get vendors engaged. We may find the relationship has changed with vendors, and that might well have changed the way that we deliver projects, or at least it might have changed the way we think about how we design our architecture to be more resilient. So I'll go back to you, Thomas, again, and just start with you in terms of your view about how this the uncertain times we talk about, the COVID-19 crisis, has changed the way that you would view the way that you've delivered infrastructure.
Well, in fact, we had some kind of coincidence, more or less, right? So our plan was already to move to a private cloud already end of last year, and that was already, the project was running. And we were moving from VMware to an Azure stack, more or less, and moving all of the stuff to that. And and that was the major change, which was anyway ongoing, and which helped us in solving some of the challenges of this COVID-19. So we didn't have to go to a public cloud, which we could not do because we're storing patient data and medical information data and so on, and which underlies the rules of the GDPR. And there and at least from our point of view in Germany, we cannot go to any kind of public cloud, no way. But of course, we would like to use the cloud technique, and for that we moved to a private cloud and integrated that with the Cloudian hyperstore. Yeah.
So as part of that, did you find that had any issues in terms of how you went about deploying it? Because, in my experience, when you're putting a new project in, going back to our people discussion a moment ago, typically we spend a lot of time learning about a technology, maybe making mistakes, maybe getting together and discussing how to plan how we implement something. And even when we do a transformation of moving to that new technology, we typically do it together. Did you find that became a challenge, or did you change the way that you even designed the infrastructure to be more resilient in that scenario?
No, we wanted to have it quite resilient, right? So we have set up it in a totally redundant way in 2 data centers, fully redundant and able to switch over and things like that. But that was anyway planned from the very beginning, because we have to provide our services, well, not 24/7, but much more than 8/5. Yeah, so our clinics are also working on the weekends. You know, if you do dialysis, you have to go there every 3 days, and even if it's the weekend, no problem. You have to document everything. You have to charge your services and whatever. That has to run all the week over. And for that, it was already planned for high resilient kind of working. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Tammam, so again, you know, we're going to talk about the impact of the situation on PHE and how you very much would have been at the forefront of this. What have you found in terms of the infrastructure side from your perspective? Have you gone down that route of, you know, building different infrastructure, or have you had challenges with vendors perhaps?
We've had to obviously expand our existing infrastructure, and even keep some of the hardware that was due to be decommissioned. In terms of the supplier relationships, there was a lot of obviously increase in demand for resources, for data collection systems, for surveillance. So we were getting data from all sorts of additional sources. There was demand for studies and, you know, and coordination work that PHE was heavily involved in, that created extra demand on the infrastructure. And we've obviously had to expand the physical infrastructure as well to be able to cope. And we were lucky in that because of PHE's status within the government and as a Category 1 responder, we were given priority from a supply chain perspective, and even procurement rules were slightly relaxed, to facilitate that process. I think we've got good relationships with our suppliers, and they've been at the forefront. In fact, a lot of them have, you know, got in touch to say that we are able to prioritize you if you need anything. So that was a really good thing. We've also expanded and considered how to sort of expedite the process of considering public cloud. But again, that comes with its own challenges in terms of information governance and security, and we can't just make the jump without taking these into consideration, particularly because of the sensitivity of the type of data. Again, it's PII data that we store. So we've had to take that into account. We're looking at public cloud, or expanding into the public cloud. We've got our own, which I'm sure Francesco will touch upon and lead that side in terms of the high performance computing platform. But that presented, you know, the expansion and sudden expansion of systems and resources, brought with it sort of along with it some challenges for, you know, backup, for data storage, for the security of the data that we back up, things like immutability and cyber attack challenges, especially in light of what happened in Australia and the issues they've seen on their infrastructure. Right. Being part of the UK government, also made us a bit apprehensive about about potential attacks on PHE infrastructure as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about the security side in a moment, and that whole change of the way that things might have to be looked at. But Francesco, I don't know whether you wanted to finish off on that comment that Tammam made there about the HPC side of things.
Yes, sure. So we have been using on-premise cloud technology since 2015. So we run across two cloud regions, one in our data center in North London, and one in the other site that PHE has in southwest England. So across these two PHE sites, we run two cloud region environment using an open source technology called OpenStack. And in addition, we have been deploying last year for data archiving and backup the S3 geo-distributed storage system across 3 sites that run on cloud. And we have about 13 petabyte of storage, and we have about 4,000 core and 20 terabyte of RAM in terms of compute resources running across those sites. The testing and development environment, we have most of them reduced and some of them shut down during some period of peak of demand to give more space to the production system. And in this last 2 months, we have used more and more public cloud. Now, when we use public cloud resources, we of course adopt some policy and governance rules, meaning that we chose to use a cloud region that are running within the England territory, and of course every deployment that we do must be certified and go through a pen test from a third-party company that certified the security of the new environment that we deploy in different public cloud providers.
I'm interested in the choice of public cloud, really, and anybody can answer this particular question. And let me explain why. Because from a resiliency perspective, clearly you're pushing off the responsibility to somebody else. And now, if your staff can't get in or something happens, the infrastructure itself will still keep running, and everything should be fine if that provider doesn't have a problem. But clearly, by moving to the public cloud, if it isn't part of an overall plan, you could be introducing operational costs that's ongoing. You then have to have a follow-up project to move data back. So it seems like if you can use the public cloud, obviously, Thomas, but there's a positive and a negative in going down that cloud route. I don't know whether either of you want to respond on that particular comment.
Well, the public cloud may be more costly than a private cloud, right? Depending on the tariffs which apply, right? So typically the public cloud asks also for network traffic and not just for the resources used inside the cloud. And if you count all together, at least in our calculations, we think we can do it on how we have set it up now cheaper than going to a public cloud. Yeah. And secondly, there's also a customer opinion, right? And if I go to any hospital in Germany and tell them we are going to a public cloud, they will send me directly to the door. This is, at least in Germany, no go. If we can say we have a private cloud, we have a private data center set up, especially under all rules of GDPR and run under German law. So nobody else have the chance to get on the data, and it's even protected against seizing, right? So because we also run government services there, and for example, customs or other things, customs service. So the customs is running there something, and if police comes in and said we want to look in, this is very difficult for them. They have to ask for special permissions by their other government agencies to get just to get inside the house of the data center. For that, we feel more safe in doing it in that way.
Okay. Tammam, Francesco, your opinion about the cloud side of things?
We have a decision-making process that keep in consideration a number of factors. For instance, the data gravity is one of the aspects that are considered when we choose one environment or one other, and of course the sensitivity and so on. So we typically, for workload that need to analyze a large amount of data, for instance, the whole genome sequencing analysis services that run on the high performance computing, that type of workload involve several hundred of terabytes of data. So that is typically a workload that we manage on premise. Whereas services and applications that are primarily used by end users that are outside the organization, So, for instance, outbreak monitoring platform that require to be accessed by a number of hospital and other government organization. We consider the option to run in public cloud environment, assuming that we can implement that mitigation policy to make sure that the data will remain always in England. It's all about also the expected uptime, and some of the architecture that we deploy are also having a hybrid type of make use of hybrid resources that partially run, for instance, on a cloud provider and some on other or on our on-premise infrastructure. I think we are learning, and from the lesson learned, we are approaching a phase now where we will provide more resilience to our on-premise sites. For instance, having more than one internet provider. So normally we have at the moment the primary internet provider where we have public IP address that are routed within our data center, and then we have backup internet link primarily used for outbound traffic, just in case the primary internet provider should go down. However, we are already started improvement in that sense to have the ability of having public IP address routed through two different internet provider. So it's also making sure that systems that are very, very critical in situations like this one, typically platforms that are involved with monitoring outbreaks are hyper resilient in terms not only of course, of power, where data center have generator, UPS, etc., but also making sure that from internet bandwidth and reachability of our data center, we are mirrored in that sense.
When I listen to that, I think a lot of these things might have been there anyway. You might have done a lot of this work already, so you might well have, done the resilient network connecting, and all of those other things would have been standard. But has any of this stuff really been driven or increased in terms of its delivery simply because of the scenario we're in? Now, I would ask, I'm going to ask Tammam to answer that one from two angles, really. I mean, clearly, one, you are in the business of needing to do that because you are responding to this incident. But at the same time, some of it must be simply because you have to make sure that you can operate effectively going forward as a business, as an organization, even if it hadn't been this particular incident, if it had been a different type incident. So do you think a lot of things are being driven by the fact that you are being increased in terms of their delivery because of what's gone on?
I think a lot of it has been accelerated because of the incident. In terms of the way we provide services, there's been a bit of, as we discussed earlier, there's been a bit of a culture change as well. I mean, the organisation is quite flexible, as Francesco mentioned earlier, in terms of working practices, and has always allowed colleagues to work from home. But that, I think, as that became a mandatory thing rather than a preference, that then led to a lot of demand on the infrastructure. As Francesco said, what we noticed is that we were basically reaching capacity from in terms of our internet connectivity. We had to factor in. Yes, we had already considered sort of enhancements to the resiliency, but that had to be accelerated tremendously in order to be able to provide the sufficient capacity to cope with the amount of data that's then traversing our internet uplinks, as well as to ensure that if we had an outage, we've got resilient links that can capitalize on existing investments in the other data centers to route data that way.
Okay. In terms of sort of finalizing on this section, imagine, we get to the end of this event in the next couple of months, say, certainly in Europe, we seem to be on top of it. In the UK, we seem to be on top of it. So imagine we get a bit further on and we go back to a bit more sort of traditional practice. People are allowed back into offices a bit more. Starting with you, Thomas, do you think that looking forward that you'll think about more resilient infrastructure in terms of your design going forward, simply because of what you learned during this period, or maybe even to mitigate this happening again in the future, if you have a second wave or a third wave of this problem? What
we're going to change if we get a third wave? That's the question?
Well, just have you learned anything from what's happened in the last few months that may make you think about future design and may make you think about how you build things in the future?
Mm-hmm. No, I would say we wouldn't change anything, because we have done an virtualization of the whole. Let's start differently. We have our medical organization, which we are doing the infrastructure for, has 250 distributed clinics across Germany. So that's already running since 20 years or so. And 3 years ago, we have virtualized everything in a centralized data center. And in that period, we already learned how to set up the links, how to dimension the throughput and everything like that. And the last step was just beginning of this year in moving from virtualizing to a cloud infrastructure. And that did not change the underlying ideas, strategies, and engineering, not so much, right? The only thing is that we get a little bit more flexible in assigning resources, in distributing the disk space across the various applications and things like that. So the general ideas are still okay. They are working, and probably we had not really big outages, little bit, but this is daily business, right? You always have this performance issues. It's either network issue or an application issue or whatever, and that we are following up. And I think we would have had in the same way if there would be no COVID crisis coming up. So I don't think we really had challenges through the crisis in the last months, except for the personal things I mentioned in the beginning, but not from the technology, not really. Okay, well, it's good to know that you were confident about your infrastructure in the first place, which is a very positive thing. Tammam, Francesco, have you got any equivalent sort of comments? Do you think you would have changed your opinion about the way you were running things before, based on what you've learned through this, in terms of an infrastructure perspective, that is?
Well, I think in terms of the way things have changed for us, I think a lot of that would be driven mainly by users' behaviours. If users continue to work from home in the new norm, as it were, the new normal, as has been called, then obviously we would have to adapt the infrastructure to be able to continue to support that working practice. For us, I think it's not going to go sort of away anytime soon for PHE. Although I know you mentioned in the next couple of months for PHE. Because of the nature of the organisation, we expect to be ramping up as we get into the autumn and winter months, because that's where we have to be ahead of the curve, basically. Because if things ramp up, God forbid, and there's a second wave, or it returns naturally through because it's flu season, then we need to hopefully be in a better position by then. So we're expecting demand to potentially increase.
So it sounds like you've got work to do to keep looking at your infrastructure and keep working out what you can do to make sure you're ready for that. So, there may be other businesses who might think the same thing. They might think if there is a second or third wave, if people are let back into the office and go back out again, they may have to keep on working towards that. So, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Francesco, anything more you'd like to add on that one?
So, I think Tammam was just mentioning the fact that we are accelerating some of the program that we were planning to deliver in the next 24 months. Primarily is decommissioning legacy systems, meaning that clearly the workload and the number of users that Public Health England see using a platform like the one that we are currently using related to the COVID-19. So the number of the average user vary significantly. So normally when there isn't an outbreak, we have, I don't know, in order of hundreds of users per day, and during an outbreak of this relevance, we are talking about several thousand of users every day. And even though the application and all the system had been virtualized 15 years ago, it's not about just having the ability of running in digital environment, but having those applications being cloud native in the sense of being able to elastically make use of resources. So when there are 10 users, I don't know, using just a front end of a web application that is composed of 10 web server and a backend that run on 2 database server, and when we have several thousand of users concurrently requesting access to the same application, scaling dynamically over several tens of web server, and equally scaling the backend. So the migration of legacy system from traditional virtual monolithic application towards a more cloud native architecture, it's something that we are definitely accelerating much faster than we thought initially.
Okay, I think that's a very good point. So let's move on to the next section, and let's talk about some of the things we've sort of touched on already to a certain degree in security and compliance. And really we're looking here at maybe a few things. We've talked about some of the issues with public cloud, so maybe we don't really need to go back over that one. I think it's good just perhaps to review where we are with the remote working challenges as we get into this section. But more importantly are going to be things like ransomware, hacking, whether we've had new data compliance requirements, we touched on some of that, and whether we need to look at things like data protection and backup in a slightly different manner. And I'll give an example of that. You know, as you've got, say, fewer staff in the office, fewer people communicating with each other to identify challenges, you'd think that that might be an exposure point because people might not spot things that are occurring. So maybe automation comes in there as being useful. And obviously, just generally, you've got more and more people working from home on potentially devices that are less secure than they were when they were in the office. And if they still need to access the same data sets, the same applications, that represents a different attack vector for people. So do you think that from a resiliency perspective, we really do need to be looking at the security side of things and maybe thinking about ransomware a bit more and so on? Thomas, what is your opinion on that one?
Well, we have looked at that from the very beginning, and we are using terminal servers for every user out there. So nobody is natively accessing the stuff from their PC, and so avoiding all of this kind of vectors, and the virtualized machines the people are connecting to are fully managed and fully under control of the IT department. So nobody can install any software there. It's closed for that, right? And they can just access the permitted application, nothing else. So from our point of view, we have a quite secure environment with the additional challenge of this terminal server stuff, right? Which also may have impacts on performance if it's too highly used, but we haven't. It was not really a problem in the past. It worked out fine. It was good engineered. So for that, that's our approach to do things like that. But you're right. If you let everybody from its home PC who is doing whatever things every day, which he's not allowed to do from his office PC or from his office laptop, and let him access everything, there may come up additional attack vectors from every kind of, for example, this banking hacks, that may happen to other applications as well.
And I guess, that extends to a certain degree to platforms like we're using now. Who would have thought we would have had the Zoom challenges that we've had with people having to understand how to use Zoom and and Zoom bombing becoming an expression that we've probably never heard before, needing to lock down Zoom. And even just that is, I think, an interesting scenario, because that's brought in significant risk in its own right. And I'll give you an example, Francesco and Tammam, because obviously you're in the UK and the PHE side of things. I'm sure I remember in the early days of the government presenting through Zoom that they forgot to take down the meeting ID on at least one of the press briefings. So, inadvertently they exposed data to the wide world that could have allowed people to log into that environment. So it's pretty clear that without thinking about it, you could quite easily have challenges here, and even more so from your perspective in PHE, because you have to be so much more careful about what you're doing.
That's right. Yeah, that was particularly funny actually. But because of the nature of the organisation, the fact that we hold PII data, everything that we do is highly secure, and we're constantly monitoring the network. We are classed as critical national infrastructure as far as the UK government is concerned. There's additional scrutiny, especially from for connections from outside of the United Kingdom. Potential for cyber attack and stuff like that. Excuse me. So we've had to bolster that. We've all become, I think, security conscious. We had a program in place to replace our existing load balancers, but we've accelerated that process and incorporated the security aspect of it. And whatever we do, we run whatever changes we make, we run pen testing against, as Francesco touched on earlier, because we appreciate the sensitivity of the type of information that we collect, the potential for the value of the data, because it's one of the critical assets of the organisation, really, as well as the public impact of any potential breaches.
Has that made you, within PHE, Francesco, think about maybe protecting data in a different way? So, we've seen a lot of recent technology look at things like object locking and protecting data so that it's immutable pretty much forever, so that, it's almost like that virtual air gap. And I just wonder if you've, had to think about the way you're doing data differently because of that.
Yeah, I think we have been using on-premise, in the on-premise cloud, a number of security rules or guidance to improve the security posture of the organization broadly in every single layer. So thinking about where it's necessary to have encryption at rest, so when it's necessary to have disk already encrypted with an encryption key, or whether the file system that run on those disk is encrypted, and whether the database have encrypted fields, and so on. We are trying to constantly look at those challenges and learning how to improve daily the security aspect of our infrastructure. And I think security is not something that you implement once and you feel comfortable that a penetration test has been run and certified on your system, but you have to constantly looking at way that mitigate new vulnerability that are found periodically in the technology that we use. Public Health England, I think, is also we work very closely with NCSC, which is the National Cybersecurity Centre in UK. So we have a very close relationship, and that, of course, is also a good help. So systems are not only monitored within Public Health England, but the internet traffic that traverse the national backbone is also monitored by other government agencies. So when international attack happen, we are also constantly dialoguing with colleagues, and that helped significantly.
Okay, great. Now I'd like to go on and move on to our fourth section. So in this section, really, I just want to touch on some of the operational challenges that we see. Now, some of these could relate to things like budget. So, you know, it may well be that we've seen increased budgets, and it may well we've seen budgets constrained or at least under pressure because we've had to move into new technology pretty quickly. We may have seen things like new data requirements. There may have been new types of data that organizations are having to actually create in order to store additional information. Now, for the two of you, the two companies that we're talking here, some of that may be relevant, some of it may be not. For example, it may be necessary with social distancing measures to start tracking more about where people's movements are within a building, and that might, you know, require more data. And ultimately, we might see things change around process. So it may well be with fewer people. We've got more need to look at things like automation. We might have more needs to look at things like systems that can actually heal themselves, that are more resilient, that can recover. And that might be part of our thinking in terms of how we actually change our operational process. So Thomas, coming to you first on that one. Have you got any thoughts about how operationally we might have changed the way that we're working in this crisis?
Well, you know, I think there may be a large number of organizations who has budget problems, right, due to just less income. Yeah, so in the health sector, at least in our particular area in Germany, we were lucky, yeah, because I think we didn't lost any patient during the crisis, so they kept, and they're all unfortunate for them, but you know, chronic patients, so they come up a lot of times, and so the income situation did not change so much, at least from the overview, right? So
yeah,
and there were even more things to charge, right? Additional hygienic measures in the clinics would have been paid by the insurances. So you, as a physician, you can ask for additional money to keep everything clean, to give masks to the patients, and so on and so on. But it has no impact on IT or so, right? So this is not
medical. Do that within the office. No, you know, not unless you need to do social distancing within the office, and you have a requirement there. That, you know, that could be an obvious need, or it could be related to, you know, you said you're running your own private cloud, so you're having to maintain that infrastructure, and you're having vendors come in to maintain equipment. Maybe you have to look at process around that differently. That, you know, that might be an issue for some organizations.
Yeah, it did not happen. So we got the support for the private cloud from the vendor of the private cloud. So no additional traffic in the data center for that. And of course, maybe if a blade goes out of operations and somebody has to come in, but this did not change to before, right? That was always the case. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Tammam, from your perspective, operationally, process-wise.
At the moment, I think because we're in the midst of the response, I think the government has quite rightly set aside a specific budget that, you know, to deal with all the support, sort of incident support related expenses. The challenge for us is going to be after the incident is then done, and that would have resulted, no doubt, in not just the increased capacity, but also new ideas. And we work with scientists and brilliant people who, you know, will see this as an opportunity to protect the health better of the public better going forward, and that's sort of bound to bring about changes in the amount of data and the type of data and the type of, you know, questions and surveys and surveillances that the scientists are going to look to conduct going forward. And I'm sure that will bring about its own challenges, because there is, as with everybody else, there's budget constraints and a lot of pressure on IT to reduce expenditure. So I don't know how we're going to balance the books, really.
Well, I guess, you know, if you're generating new sources of data, you've got to put it somewhere, and, you know, that becomes a challenge in balancing whether you think that data needs to be retained and whether you should throw it away. Maybe you have to look at data practices again and say, should we, throw something else out and keep the data, keep some other data? I guess it introduces lots of decision points where you have to go and think about things in a bit more detail.
I think we have to be smart about it because you've got to utilize the storage that you have. For example, just use storage as an example. You've got to start utilizing that better and be smart about how you utilize the storage. So you tier your storage. You've got if you're using flash storage for demanding workloads, production systems, and then any data that's collected that can be archived, you put that into a relatively sort of cheaper platform, such as an object store, for example. So you've got to be smart about where you store the data. I don't think we discard any data within the organization because a lot of it is quite useful to the scientists. There's a huge amount of data that gets generated, and a lot of it has to be retained because it is useful in some form or another to studies and research.
Okay, Francesco, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I echo what Tom was saying. I think is making sure that you use at the best the more cost-effective technology, and making sure that you provide performance where those performance are strictly needed, and you provide environments that have a better, a more cost-effective, let's say, underpinning hardware. For instance, we have the backup and archiving and cataloging system for the scientific data, which is pretty large and run, as I said, on the S3 system that we have been deploying last year, which is underpinned by cloud. And that environment use a type of hardware which is very cost effective, is leveraging erasure coding not only at the data center level, but erasure coding geographically. So that means that the cost per terabyte is it's very, very competitive compared with a normal RAID storage system that you would build in a rack. So we can't so the policy is not like we can't delete data. We have retention policy which are quite long, sometimes more than 10 years. So we have to make sure that we use the duplication, for instance, technology to make sure that data doesn't get duplicated during the access or manipulation by different user, and making sure that we use compression and other technology, as I say, like erasure coding, to make sure that we have the most effective, cost-effective solution in place.
So it sounds like an opportunity to go back and do a bit of housekeeping in that sense. I think if you haven't done it before, you need to do it. You should be doing it anyway. Okay, so we've only got a few minutes left, and I think I just like to do a bit of a wrap up, and we'll go through everybody and just get your final thoughts really about what your experiences have been over this last few months, and how we go forward. How do you think it will change the way that we're thinking about things? Thomas, I'll wrap up with you if you want to start and give us your thoughts. Yeah.
So, well, it was mainly a change in the social environment of the offices, right? So people have not been there anymore. You have to call them up and so on and so on. From the general work, I would say it worked to some extent quite okay. It could have been worse, yeah. So you have to move the people out. They have to be able to do video conferencing and have to be available to some extent. But we had processes in place which worked fine and which have been kept and which worked then on maybe a little bit slower than before, but it worked. Yeah, so we have to deliver every 3 months a new version of our software because of regulation issues. They change regulation every 3 months. That worked out fine. So we could do that. We could do it remotely to every location which we have done before, and so on and so on. So Well, of course, you're thinking the one or other point of your daily work, whether you could do it better. And of course, there are improvements possible, and the force may be stronger than before to really do the change then.
At the end of the day, we're reflecting to say that you're saying it is always worth reevaluating the way you're doing things. For the purposes of time, I'm going to go to Tammam. Give me your opinions. I'm going to have to keep you to a fairly short leash.
Sure. I think as Tom mentioned, this is brought about sort of a cultural change. People used to think that working from home it wasn't very productive, and I think COVID-19 has proved otherwise. People can work from home, and I think this change is here to stay.
Wonderful. Francesco, last comments from you then. Thank you.
Yeah, so very shortly, I think, I totally agree with Thomas and Tammam in terms of cultural change, and we have been proved that actually the productivity can be kept very high even working from home. In terms of purely from technology point of view, I think that the use of the ability of running workload with a flexibility that can make use of hybrid multi-cloud, making sure that you are not vendor locked and you use technology to enable you to keep your workload movable and for instance through containers and so on. That is also a trend that we see being accelerated by these events.
Great. Okay, well, I'll just remind everybody that obviously we were very kindly sponsored by Cloudian for this presentation. And if you want to go and find out about Cloudian, you can find them at www.cloudian.com. And with that, I'd just like to say, Tammam, Francesco, Thomas, thank you very much for your time indeed. There's some really good and useful and really helpful points there. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you and everybody for joining.
Thank you.